everybody. It is 1 o'clock and we are going to get started. We are so excited today because we have NevadaTeach Master Teachers here who are going to present with us on how they have incorporated culturally relevant pedagogy across their coursework from step 1 all the way up. NevadaTeach is at the University of Reno, Nevada, and it's in its 8th year. And since its inception, it has celebrated over 100 mathematics and science graduates. And so I am going to then pass the mic over to our wonderful NevadaTeach Master Teachers to tell us a little bit more about themselves and how they have embedded culturally relevant pedagogy into their coursework.
Sure thing. I'll go ahead and share my screen and then we can get started. Our first slide, we're going to just, like you said, introduce who we are. I can go first. My name is Megan Beckham. I'm one of the master teachers with NevadaTeach. My background is in science. I taught high school science for 14 years, mostly the physical science. And then I'll let Glenn introduce himself.
Hey, hi, I'm Glenn. I am the mathematics. I was the mathematics person for a long time, but now we have 2 mathematics people, which I'm really excited about. I've been with NevadaTeach for 8 years as well. So it's been an amazing 8 years of working with amazing students.
And I forgot to say what I teach. So I am one of the co-instructors for Step 1. I co-teach research methods with Glenn, and I also co-teach the apprentice teaching seminar. And I'll give you a second to introduce what you teach, Glenn, but we're just representing for the rest of us who are not here, because we want to make sure this is a group effort. It's not just the 2 of us who have done this.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important to recognize because we were very much inspired by the UTeach community as well. We wouldn't have done this if we wouldn't have been attending the conferences and learning from y'all. So I don't teach step 1 and step 2 anymore because we have so many amazing people here, but I teach knowing and learning, the math section of CI, and then I've assisted with PBI on the practicum side, research methods, and then apprentice teaching as well. So I think that's everything. It's a lot. So in 2019, I attended the Knowing and Learning pre-session at the UTeach conference, and there's a lot of conversation. Even in 2018, there was conversation about how do we incorporate culturally responsive or relevant teaching, and I took that back to NevadaTeach, and the only material I had was Geneva Gay's material at that time, because I hadn't really figured out anything. But I incorporated that in Knowing and Learning right away. Then in 2021, the Equity and Racial Justice and STEM Teacher Development pre-conference was so amazing. Because it was virtual, our entire team was there, and our entire team was just inspired to actually pull from Knowing and Learning into all of the other courses. So right away, step 2 started using it. Step 1, I think, started the very next semester after that. And then we pulled that material all the way through. And we started using culture responsive teaching in the brain instead of Geneva Gay's really difficult book.
And just to add, this is a priority for everyone in our program. And so we've had multiple conversations on in the years prior to really implementing this, that we should do this. This is important. It's important to all of us. And then now we're rolling out our first iteration of it and still learning.
Yeah, because even though I was the first person in the program to start it in a course, we started it in Knowing and Learning, where, right, that's the theory class. But I didn't tell all of the other instructors, hey, you need to do this. It really was an organic effort. When the virtual conference afterwards, we came together and said, we need to do this. And it was very much a team group effort.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we build this in step 1 and kind of scaffold it through to step 2, since those are the classes I'm more familiar with. Our goal in step 1 is to build that awareness and knowledge of culturally responsive teaching in the classroom. And we do this in 2 ways. We ask our learners to read chapter 2 from Zaretta Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. We do an online web campus discussion and then come back and have a whole class discussion after that. We also include a few prompts specifically to get our learners starting to think about how they can do this in the classroom in the step 1 template. So if you're not familiar with the book, chapter 2 is called What's Culture Got to Do with It? It's a really great introduction to students who may have heard about this before or maybe not. It is kind of divided into 3 parts, and the first really focuses on these different levels of culture. And she has this really amazing image of a tree and kind of thinking about how we have different levels of culture, from the surface level, things we can see like clothes and art, and then going to shallow culture. These are higher emotional impact on trust, things like eye contact, personal space, and then finally the deep culture, those roots there that you see, which are intense emotional impacts on trust, really like our basic worldview kind of things. The chapter then goes into cultural archetypes. She really focuses on 2, communalism and individualism, and then written and oral culture. And then the chapter ends with the socio-political context and talking about how essential it is for us as educators to understand the socio-political context that we're teaching in. So for the discussion prompts, we really just want our learners to read the chapter and reflect on things that they notice. How does it resonate with them? We ask them to think about if it connects to them based on their experiences in K-12 education. Does it connect with them from their family's experiences? And then we prompt them to think about what questions they have after reading that chapter. And we do ask them to respond to each other. We as the instructors go in and also respond to them and kind of add to the discussion. I pulled out some of the kind of the themes that we see from this. These are all taken from this most recent semester with the step 1 learners. And I'm just going to talk about this too. I have highlighted there because, like I said, they're representative of what a lot of the learners say. That first one, she's referencing the how rhyme, motion, and emotion from an oral tradition maximizes the brain's memory system. A lot of our learners are surprised by that. They haven't heard of an oral tradition, so they were really interested in how learners can learn better that way. And then another one that really kind of jumps out at most of the learners there is how the difference between communalism and individualism. The book has a really nice chart in there about how countries rank on those 2 different ones. And the United States is pretty strong in individualism. So this learner's commenting on how interesting it would be to come from another culture and have to realize this is different here. And then you can see there's a lot of questions. This generates a lot of questions. And then we have a really great discussion the next week. And then lastly, in step 1, we implement these 2 prompts here. What conceptions and or background knowledge will your learners be coming into the lesson with? We really want them to understand that the learners in their classroom are not blank slates. They're coming in with their own knowledge, they have ideas. And then that second one there, how are they going to ensure that the learning environment is positive and their learners feel comfortable with them? So sometimes in the beginning of step 1, they struggle to answer these prompts, but as you can imagine, through the semester, they get more sophisticated. They start to get to know their classroom better, and we see some really good things here. And then step 2, let me go to the next slide. So then step 2, just like it says, it takes it the next step further. They're reading another chapter, chapter 3 in step 2, and they also include a few more prompts into their lesson plans. So the goal here is to create the link between the adolescent learner and how that looks in a middle school setting. So some of the first thing they do there, are you all seeing this? Do I need to move that? Let's see. Okay, oops, let me go back one. Okay, so they start out in week 2 there. They talk a little bit about the adolescent learner. They listen to this really great podcast about the adolescent learner brain, how it's different from elementary versus high school. And then they hand out 2 kind of short readings. The first one is that infographic there from the Equity Alliance called Culturally Responsive Teaching Matters. It gives them an introduction to some of the terms and what it can look like in the classroom. They do that as a whole class discussion. It's just like a 1-pager. and then give them some time to read 7 Culturally Responsive Teaching Strategies and Instructional Practices by Tyrone Howard. They have them read that, talk in their groups, and then have a whole class discussion about how can we take from these 2 things and really put that into practice into our teaches this semester. The homework from that week is chapter 3. This is your brain on culture. And this one, our science majors do like. It goes into the physiology of the brain and learning there. So they also have some prompts on web campus and then come back and have, I keep going backwards. And then they come back and have a whole class discussion. Some of the key takeaways. So these are quotes from their students that are representative of the whole here. They talk about the challenge as culturally responsive teachers is knowing how to create an environment that the brain perceives as safe and nurturing so it can relax, let go of any stress, and turn its attention to learning. Sometimes in step 2, because I've come in there and worked with some of them different times, they talk about how they connect it to themselves. In some of their college classes, they feel more relaxed and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. I feel like I belong in this class. I understand it. I like it better. I think I'm learning better. The next one there is just that importance of making students feel safe, feel comfortable in their learning environment so they can expand their experiences. And then the last one there about understanding a student's culture is directly tied to the way that they process this new information. So again, they come back and have a class discussion about that. The prompts that they include, that first one there is how can they make that content relevant and meaningful to their learners? And then again, looking at, our learners don't come to us as blank slates. So how are they able to bring their own unique perspectives into each of the lessons that they teach? And then the last 2 are challenging them to provide choices for the learners and authentic opportunities, as well as give them those opportunities for collaborative peer-to-peer interaction. So really making it learner-centered and putting them into the driver's seat for that. So again, these are in all 3 of the lessons, and again, they get more sophisticated over time.
So knowing and learning is where we do most of the work with this. We currently have, all of us have agreed that our main text for this will be the Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Hammond. And I've added and replaced some of the assignments that we used to do. So go ahead, Megan. I started with Geneva Gay's Culturally Responsive Teaching text. It's a great text for graduate students. It was not a good text for undergrads. They were really frustrated and we really struggled with it. So the very next semester, Knowing and Learning for us is a fall only class. We moved to the Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. Our learners loved it. It was so much more successful because they didn't have to weed through the graduate level reading. It was bad. So like someone commented that it was a great book and our students agree. Go ahead, Megan. Besides reading the entire text, another thing I did is instead of doing the interview assignment that we did that UTeach does, I changed it last year to a impact of culture on learning interview assignment. So they're still doing an interview assignment, but instead of interviewing with respect to content, now they're interviewing with respect to culture. They have to interview a teacher. It can be a teacher. It has to be a K-12 teacher, prefer secondary. And that teacher should be in their content area, although not necessarily. I don't specify that. But they interview that teacher with respect to culture. How do they create culture in their classroom? How do they incorporate learners' culture in their classroom? And then they interview a student, and I do specify a student different from you. And how they interpret it is open to them. But I tell them, it has to be someone who is very different from you. And I'll let you decide how that plays out. The comments I've gotten from this after this 1 year were just phenomenal because, of course, we always judge everything based upon our experience, and this really forced them to think about the experience of other people and how those other people interacted with the school structure. And it was amazing, much more successful than I expected, to be honest. Next. There's other things that this is actually how I break down what the expectations of the paper is. They have to discuss their own experience with culture. They have to compare contrast with their interviewed learners, and then a compare contrast with the teacher, and the discussion of how the teacher includes just culture. I've been very sad to hear that many math teachers said, I've never really thought about that, which was unfortunate, but not unexpected. And then throughout the course, there's this thread of practical considerations for teaching. Every assignment, every discussion prompt has that practical consideration for teaching language. Next. Some of the other things that I've done, there's a prompt in the classroom environment paper that I give that says, how will you utilize culture responsive teaching in your regular classroom practice? And then the very final exam has a prompt, how does culture influence learning, and how will you use culture to help learning connect with content and accelerate learning? So it's not just reading the book, it's not just our discussion around that. There's also a completely revamped interview project, and then the thread throughout the other assignments. And that's how I've really kind of brought this into knowing and learning. This next semester is the first time I'll have step 1 and step 2 students in knowing learning who have done chapter 2 and chapter 3. So I'm not sure how I'm going to manipulate and adjust the assignments, but clearly I need to adjust now because they're coming to me with this knowledge instead of having it fresh. So I'm really excited about that.
We have had a conversation how, they can read it multiple times, and especially from a year-to-year perspective, they can get new things out of it and with more classroom experience.
Yeah, it's really exciting. The other thing, the next class that we've incorporated this in is in classroom interactions. We do have separate sections, one for math, one for science, but it's a similar application in both. There's no specific reading, but we've applied it in a practical way to their teaching. So the reason we split up our math and science is our science educator and our math educator really wanted to do a deep dive into math methods and science methods, and we couldn't do that in a combined course. So by splitting it up, we can have a very good deep discussion into methods unique to math and science, which then leads us to how to apply culture responsive teaching to math and to science. Next. And so for every, I just am finishing teaching CI. Every single method that we talk about, whether it's teaching math with technology or algebra tiles, or each individual method we talk about, every day we actually have a modification or type of these prompts, these 3 prompts. How can this method be? How can you adapt? How will you incorporate? So that way it's a daily topic of conversation in math and in science and math. The lesson plans are all required to address culture responsive teaching in their lesson plans. Go ahead, Megan.
One more.
Yep.
There we go.
And in the science, they're pulling from ambitious science teaching. And ambitious science teaching does address it in one of the chapters. And so again, they're pulling from this text in the science methods and really addressing it regularly and in an ongoing way into their practice of teaching. And then next, Megan. Both of us in the math section and then the science section are using these questions on the reflection after their teaches. And our CI teaches, there's 4 teaches, a pair of 2 and then a pair of 2. So they're getting that little extra teaching and the ability to correct, modify the second day after the first day. But we always, both sections have used these questions as the prompts for the teaching reflection. And then in PBI, we are doing something even more different, but extending it again. PBI is using these 2 books or 3 books to kind of support, and Universal Design has a lot of great resources that can facilitate and help push this further. Chapter 5 of the project-based learning in the math classroom has a specific chapter on it. Chapter 1 and 6 in the project-based teaching and for the science is really powerful. And it's just bookending week 2 and week 6. How are we really addressing equity? How are we addressing individual needs of each and every learner in the classroom? So we're pulling some different texts at PBI level to kind of help support and encourage and develop some further new ideas. These are our prompts for PBI. Right, we're really talking about social justice, which is a great connection with PBI. The hidden curriculum, looking at the differences between equality and equity, as well as power. So all of these kind of are refreshing their ideas from knowing and learning, because those conversations are also held in knowing and learning. But it's been probably a year and a half since they've had knowing and learning by the time they're getting PBI. So having that refreshing and the conversation just further extends those ideas and makes them more powerful. They have to address it in the lesson plan in an explicit way, so that in their PBI unit, they are being asked again to apply the theory into their actual teaching. Creating a classroom environment that supports learning, differentiation, scaffolding strategies, and again, equity, not equality.
All right, and I'll talk a little bit about the apprentice teaching seminar, since I'm one of the co-teachers for that. And like as Glenn mentioned, we're kind of excited because the current apprentice teachers we have not had a lot of the things we're implementing now. So we're really kind of excitedly watching this cohort that's coming through to see if there is any change or any difference or more sophistication by the time they get to apprentice teaching seminar. In seminar, we do some specific activities. We have continual discussions, and then I'll let Glenn talk about how the university and the mentor teachers embed these questions and discussions throughout the semester as they meet. We don't meet for a long period of time in seminars. I'm sure if you've taught that, it's pretty quick, and they spend most of the time out doing their apprentice teaching. But in one of the times that we meet, we bring them, we focus really on this. And so at the beginning of the time we meet, we ask them to take some time to have a personal reflection, writing down their current thoughts on culturally responsive teaching and what their current questions are on culturally responsive teaching. And they do spend quite a while on this because they've been in the classroom. We usually do this around the 6th week or so they've had a lot of time. And then we watch a short video on culturally responsive teaching, and it goes again back into the levels of culture, kind of a nice refresher. It's a short video. We have some time to discuss it, and then we let them listen to an excerpt of The Cult of Pedagogy, which is a really great podcast for educators. She invites Zaretta Hammond in as a guest for this one, and Zaretta Hammond talks about some ways to be more culturally responsive in your classroom. And it's interesting as they listen to it. Some of our apprentice teachers, you can see them kind of nodding like, okay, I'm doing some of this, like this looks familiar. And others are like, oh, maybe, I could do some of this. So I can almost see them kind of processing it as they're listening. Our goal in apprentice teaching seminar, because we don't see them as long, is just to really build that continuous reflective practitioner in them. And so we expose them to a lot of resources where they can continue to learn on this topic and other topics. So podcasts are one way that we found that they really enjoy. And then after we do all that, we come back to their reflection and give them some more time to now write their current thoughts on culturally responsive teaching. And then we take some of their questions and have a discussion if we have time for that.
As far as the actual application of the university supervisor interface, we do a lot of conversation with them So I've done all of the math students up till now, and I've always had this conversation with them regularly every week. But it's nice to now they're starting to get that connection with the theory as well. And in the past years, there was no theory, it was just a conversation. The phrase that, like the warm demander phrase from Zaretta Hammond's book and Geneva Gay's book is powerful. I use with my math students a different phrase because I had a principal who she said this every single conversation. And it was loving harassment. So I always use both phrases, right? Are you a warm demander? Are you lovingly harassing these learners so that it's harder to do nothing than to do something? And it really does change the perception of the math students about those learners who are sitting there with their heads down or not really fully engaged, because it's really hard to get upset and angry when you're lovingly harassing someone. And that's the whole point of the language, is it changes our perception, not necessarily what they're doing initially, but when they start loving harassing, it absolutely changes what's going on in the classroom as well. It just changes the whole environment, really. So that's an ongoing topic of conversation, and something that all of the university supervisors are asking about on a daily basis. When we're doing observations, when we're doing those face-to-face meetings and reflections after the teaches, are you lovingly harassing these kiddos? Are you being that warm demander? How are you applying this to each and every learner, not the average of learners? So it's at the apprentice teaching level, it all kind of comes together in a powerful way, even though not every school and not every classroom is open and supportive of doing this. Even here in Reno, there are schools that are hyper traditional in the math, and it's guided notes and very rigidly structured. But that doesn't mean you can get away with not being a warm demander and lovingly harass those kiddos to step up and learn.
And then we talk as master teachers. I'm just thinking when you say that term, lovingly harass the math students, because Glenn talks to the math students and uses that term, and our science students hadn't heard that. They'd heard warm demander, but lovingly harass. And so I was just thinking this past semester, we had a good discussion about what does that look like. And so Mandy and I acted it out, and we were like, can you see the board? Like, do I need to move you closer? Like, here's a pen, like all the things. And they were like, oh, I do feel harassed. And it was really fun to like act that out and show them like all the things they could do. And then they were adding like what they do in their classrooms too. So we had a whole list of ways to encourage learners to participate and engage.
And then because our graduates have not had access to us in this way, I did a book study in 2020 on culture response and teaching in the brain with some of our graduates. And I'll probably cycle back and do another one here in another, I think next year right. You can't do it too often, but I do a book study every year with math graduates, and 2020 was that one. Really good comments from that. And I think if you haven't done that, I encourage you. We actually buy the book and provide it to our graduates on whatever book study they're doing, and the response is phenomenal when we're just in there having that conversation.
And we didn't want to take the whole time just to talk about and tell you what we do, but we wanted to give some time for you all to ask questions. So if you want, I'll put our emails in the chat so I can stop sharing my screen and we can all see each other. But we welcome your questions. If you have specific questions on what we do in the individual courses or experiences with it, or if you want to share insights of your own, we'd love to learn from you all as well.
Megan, I know there's a question in the chat that just came in from Zane. I don't know about the most impactful chapters. In Knowing and Learning, I have them read the entire thing. And it's like, that's the appropriate place to read the whole book, I feel. But it's been really powerful, and it's replaced a whole bunch of the other readings. Like we use the chapter on brain to get into the psychology of it. And so we've used that book to kind of replace some of the other readings. And then I have students look up the psychologists and do little 5-minute presentations on psychologists each day. So that way we're still accessing the psychologists and the theories, but we're shifting more and more towards the culture side of things, especially connecting it with how people learn to. How people learn to has had some further connections with us as well. I don't know if that fully answers the question.
Yeah, I think it might be ambitious to try to go whole hog, because I'm not as familiar with the book, but if you were to identify those essential elements, which I think you did, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I want to put a plug in, just the part in chapter 2 about the levels of culture seemed like it was really eye-opening for a lot of students. They, like Glenn mentioned, when they do the CI interview, they realize that other people's experiences are different from my own. And so when they are looking through this and they realize, oh, if someone's not making eye contact with me, I think they're rude, but it's not rude in their culture. And so, and then like things like raising hands versus like interrupting each other. There's different ways of speaking that are culturally appropriate. And it just, I think that's a good little, if you want to just pull like one part of chapter 2 out, that was a good one.
I like the idea of introducing that early on, because when we get to step 2 and we start talking about, we've got parts in our lesson plan too, where we want them to describe accommodations, modifications, and we want them to describe, there's a piece in there about equity, but what do they put in that section? And so for them to branch outside of, yes, I've got these students with accommodation plans, like, okay, what else is happening in your classroom? And some students will hear this topic and they'll jump to race, or they'll jump to, ethnicity, or some of them will jump to cultural, like start having cultural thoughts and discussions. But I think that chapter sounds really appealing to me for my students to open their minds to all the things that they could really be considering about their students.
Yeah, there's a lot of ahas there.
And, in math, the whole cooperative versus
Communalism.
Yes, communalism versus individualism. In math, that plays such a strong role, because you'll have students in the math methods who be like, okay, we should play a game and compete, and everyone just competes because everyone wants to be the winner. And it's like, no, you all wanted to be the winner, but you were the better math learners. And so then we have that conversation, and they're like, oh, that's true. Yeah, like we're not all in this individualistic approach. Some people are more collaborative and need that community-based learning. And so it's been really powerful for the math students in CI to play off of that. And they didn't have that language before the book, before they had knowing and learning. So this is the first semester I've taught CI after everyone has had this in a really deep way. And they've changed how they're doing their lesson plans because of it, which is really powerful. Pamela commented how we made an intentional decision not to duplicate. We did all sit down at a table and say, all right, how are we going to split this out? How are we going to connect the dots here? Because we didn't want it to seem repetitive. We didn't want it to seem like we were just always talking about the same thing. We wanted some different resources. And Kenneth, like, copyright violations galore. Like, honestly, I just scanned in the book and we made it available to our students. So we haven't reached that point, but at this point, I think we need to, right? Even if it's just for knowing and learning, it's worth it.
I think for knowing and learning, we still, like all of y'all, yours programs, like, we lose a few in step 1 and they're just taking it to try it. So giving them just chapter 2 to look through, and then 3. And then I think, maybe, getting it for them in your class, Glenn, knowing and learning would be a good one.
Yeah, like we need to stop doing that and either make them buy it or buy it for them. I mean, it's time.
I like your comment there, Pamela.
Hi, this is Sherry. I'm from FSU Teach, and we're doing some with culturally responsiveness in our perspectives course. but I'm wondering how you open up windows of opportunities for them to engage in like some of the really awesome curricula that's out there, particularly in mathematics, in terms of like, you know, the mathematics gerrymandering, or so like where do those where do they get exposure to those kinds of materials?
I would think PBI, right? Because then they're developing that much larger unit and then that longer content. And so I think PBI is where I've had really good conversations on that. I know in Math 305, so Math 305 is our functions and modeling class. So it's a junior level course. Our math department forced us to have a much higher level course than we initially started out with. So we've done some projects in Math 305 that also kind of address some of those topics as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And I don't teach the PBI, but I did sit in on their final project descriptions for the fall. And Mandy had them partnering with the Tahoe Environmental Research Center, which is pretty close to us here. And they were doing some amazing things with environmental justice, with the wildfire smoke and lake pollution and pollution here in Reno. So I know that they do that in PBI more.
Yeah, we had a cool experience this year for our CI students where we have an alumnus who works at the Santa Ana Wildlife Refuge, and we connected her with some students, and so they were able to ask what was an issue they were having at the wildlife refuge, and then how could they design a lesson around that had to do with symbiotic relationships. So it was really cool that they got to partner together, and she actually made a video for the students to show in the classroom of her introducing the issue. And then what was really amazing is the following week, the topic that they were covering, which is cattle tick eradication. Our local congressional representative actually signed a bill on it. So we were able to share with the students that the suggestions you were making, they're actually like implementing, not because of their suggestions, but they're implementing it right now. So it was kind of a neat connection where they could see it sort of from beginning to end, of working with a community partner to identify a problem, coming up with solutions, and then seeing how policy was implementing those solutions. And the best part was because she's an alumnus, she was really excited to work with us. So, you know, tapping into those alumni resources can be really great.
Do you do things also in your perspectives course, or how is your perspectives course tied into this strand?
So we don't have a perspectives course. So we do not. I will say one of the classes we didn't mention because we haven't included it in our specific scaffolding plan is research methods, because Glenn and I are kind of we're always changing that class. It's kind of fun. But the year before this one, we had them work a lot with community or citizen science and trying to build in that idea with them. And then our thoughts for the future is maybe doing some action research, partnering them with students or with teachers. We'll keep you posted if we change that up that way.
In FSU, we've restructured perspective, so it still focuses on disciplinary engagement and what it looks like, you know, what thinking and sense making in math and science looks like. We do that for a few weeks. Then we talk about who gets access to that depth of thought, because it's not everyone. And so we look at structural inequities that invite some people into these spaces more than others. And then the last half of the class is on culturally responsive teaching. I've used Hammond's book, but there's just, I think I got over ambitious. There's like some really lovely frameworks like CRMT2 in math, which is gorgeous, but maybe I'm thinking it's gorgeous to me because I'm an old lady and it might be too much for the students. So I'm really impressed that you're using Hammond's book to such good effect, because while she's not math and science specific, she's more focused, perhaps.
The students have really liked about the book is like every single chapter, there's something that they can directly apply to they're teaching. And that theory praxis divide isn't so great from the learner's perspective. Like it's written for teachers, and so the learners are reading it and they're like, okay, I can see the connection here, which just makes it really powerful. I think that's why we were so easily all standardized on the book, because we could all see the connections as well for them.
It does seem to progress pretty nicely through the course sequence.
And then by the time they're hitting PBI, they really do need additional resources and some different resources so that they can think deeper about some of the larger social issues that can be tackled in PBI and should be tackled in PBI. Whereas with CI, they're only teaching 4 times in such a time removed way, right? It's 2 weeks here and then, or 2 days here, and then 4 weeks later, 2 days here. So it's harder to connect. The teachers don't want those ideas connected. They've moved on. So they're really more focused on just the content of the day instead of the bigger picture, like they are in PBI.
When they do the student interview in Knowing and Learning, what kind of questions do they ask their peers, the peer who is different from themselves?
I tell them it's going to be a semi-structured interview, and I start them off with a couple of prompts. One prompt is, tell me about your cultural background and family background. So that way there's some context. And then how did that cultural background, how was that cultural background represented in school? And a lot of times what the learners come back with is, it wasn't. And then, you know, we have a branch, and if the answer is it wasn't, a follow-up question, suggested follow-up question is, how did that make you feel? How did that, like, how was that supportive of you as a learner? Or if they say it was, how did that make you feel? How did that support you as a learner? How did you feel comfortable in that classroom? Was it all classrooms or only some classrooms? It's interesting. They've come back repeatedly with, in the math classroom, we were asked to leave our culture at the door, but in English and social studies classrooms, it was welcomed in. And so then there's that conversation of, why are we doing that to kids in math when other teachers aren't? And like, that's a choice we're making. It's not a requirement of math. So it semi-structured, they hate it. The fact that it's semi-structured, they want a list of questions to ask. But I always push back on them and say, you know, I'm not in the interview. I can't tell you every question to ask. It should be a conversation about what they find important, and what each individual finds important will be different. So you really need to dive into that. I've done it the 1 year, and I'm going to continue doing it this year. But the feedback and the reflections on the paper were just phenomenal. Like, they really didn't think that it was that different for other people. And that, I think, was my biggest takeaway, is almost every student said they didn't realize that other students had such a radically different experience in the classroom than I did. So if I can get students to think, to realize that, I think that's a huge win.
Glenn and Megan, thank you for sharing so much. I have I think a question to follow up on what Glenn's sharing. By the way, I'm at LSU Go Teach and new to the group. One of the things we've talked about in our community specifically is, how are we making sure that students find their self-identity as mathematicians and scientists, particularly in marginalized populations where we don't see that maybe our community as a whole is characteristic of the diverse population that we see in our state. I see this and think that this may lend itself to students who might personally feel marginalized in this community or don't see themselves as part of this conversation, really getting an opportunity to see that, you know, where cultural appreciation has not been present in those settings, like this opens that doorway for that to be more appreciated. And I'm curious if you guys have seen any differences in how the self-efficacy of your students has grown or developed or changed as a result of having these units within your courses?
Megan, you want to go first?
Well, I'm just thinking, because we just kind of rolled this out in step 1 and 2, but I'm thinking of a conversation that we had in one of the fall classes I taught. This one young woman came back saying like she absolutely loved reading chapter 2, and she was making her husband read it because she thinks it's going to help their relationship, because she is from a Mexican American background where her family is very important to her. And, you know, she has had these conflicts with her husband where he's more of like, you know, we don't invite the grandparents over, and my parents, you know, aren't involved in it. And so she's like, this makes me feel better even in talking to him about why it's important to me to have my parents here a lot. And so just from that, she was empowered to be herself, and realizing that, you know, she was right to feel that way. So it gave her that.
I will say in my CI class, for the first time ever, almost every one of my student groups that was going on and teaching math, you know, all of the student groups used Google Translate and created English and Spanish materials for every single thing they taught. And in previous semesters, that hasn't been the case. Like I would ask, did you translate this into Spanish? And they're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And then they would. But here, like they just brought to class 2 cassettes and said, make both copies. Said, how many do you need? Well, there's 30 students in the room working in partners of 3, so make 10 of each. Like they wanted equal numbers of Spanish and English, knowing full well that a whole bunch of the Spanish ones would be thrown away. Like they didn't even try and estimate. And then they walked up to the learners and said, English or Espanol? You pick. And most learners picked both. And they're like, that was really surprising to me that they wanted both. Even though they hardly looked at the Spanish, they wanted it there just to kind of reference. So that I think that was a huge shift in what I saw for sure. It wasn't perfect. It was Google Translate. One of the students actually said, like, a learner challenged her and said, well, this isn't very good Spanish, which is hilarious, right? But she said, well, I'm sorry, I used Google Translate. I know it's not perfect. But then the young lady said, yeah, it's okay. At least you tried. Like, and so what a huge moment for my student that like, at least she tried, right? And in previous years, they wouldn't have even tried. So that was really good. I don't know if that really answers the question, but I've definitely seen some changes. They're much more responsive to the idea of being a warm demander. A different student said, you know what? I was really proud of the fact that I got this kiddo to do 2 problems that day, because all of the observations, everything they've done, all this kid did is sit there with his head down, and he did 2 problems for him that day. And you know, all he did is walk by and be like, hey, can you do a problem for me? Just do 1 problem for me. I know you can do it. I believe in you. And then he'd walk away. Right? I'm like, perfect. That's the warm demander. That's what we're looking for. And so the partner went up and asked the same kid to do a problem. The kid looked at her and said, I've already done 2. What more do you want? I'm like, good enough, you know, back off. But it was good.
I think what's interesting too on this same conversation is the students who maybe through reading these materials can recognize in their professors or in their past teachers a lack of cultural responsiveness. I think is what Zane was also getting at, you know, for them to recognize it's not just me. I shouldn't quit this science degree or this math degree because of my, you know, if I'm having these struggles in the classroom, it might be because my instructor like teaches one way into one group of students, and that can just give them the peace of mind to keep going and to find friends, you know, who they can relate to and find mentors. And I think it would give any college student a lot of perspective.
Yeah, we absolutely have conversations of, please do not judge your university faculty on these standards. Like you can't do that. Please don't do that. Which they're like, yeah, why not?
But I think that's such a good point, Rebecca. And I was just having a conversation at a workshop yesterday about that phrase imposter syndrome. And are we blaming the victim? Like, do I have to feel like an imposter? Like, what is this culture doing that makes me feel like I'm the imposter? Why isn't it more welcoming and saying, yes, you belong here in academia? So same thing, if our students are more empowered to say, you know, I feel like I belong in this class, but not this class. So that class has the problem. I really like that you put it that way.
And it goes back to that identity that Zane was talking about. We don't want the K-12 students feeling like they are imposters in a math or a science classroom. They belong. We require them to take it. They have to belong. Even if we're not creating the opportunity for them to feel like they belong.